Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start this moment by saying something that might sound hard to hear, but I believe it's the truth that can set you free. There's a lie that some of you have been carrying around for far too long. A lie that every pain you've experienced, every betrayal, every heartbreak, every tear you've cried was just a random event, a mistake, something that shouldn't have happened. And let me be real with you today. That's not what God is saying over your life. What if I told you that the very things you think were meant to break you were actually part of God's divine plan to build you up? What if I told you that sometimes God allows the hurt, not because He's punishing you, but because He's positioning you? See, some of us have been running from the pain, trying to avoid it, asking, why me, God? When the real question should be, God, what do you want me to see in this moment? What do you want me to learn in this hurt? Because God doesn't waste a thing, not your pain, not your heartache, not your suffering. I believe today God is going to show you how what hurt you is actually what's going to help you. And that what the enemy meant for evil, God is using for your good. So buckle up, because we're going to shift your perspective. You're going to walk out of here today not just healed, but empowered with the understanding that your pain is part of your purpose. Let's dive in. Pain is part of God's plan. This statement can feel difficult to accept, especially when we are in the midst of our struggles. The idea that pain isn't just random or a result of bad luck, but actually something that serves a purpose in God's greater plan for our lives can feel almost counterintuitive. We often associate pain with punishment or loss, and we tend to believe that when things hurt, something has gone wrong. But what if we reframe our understanding of pain, not as something God is using to harm us, but as a tool He uses to shape us, to prepare us for the future He has in mind? When we experience pain, we often ask, why me? Or why this? We want to understand the cause, the reason behind the suffering. It's natural to seek clarity, especially when the pain feels so overwhelming. The hardest part of going through painful experiences is not just enduring the moments of hurt, but questioning why it's happening in the first place. We wonder if God has abandoned us, or if we're being punished for something we did wrong. But in these moments, we must remind ourselves that God's ways are higher than ours. His understanding transcends our own, and His purpose is often far greater than our current comprehension. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who experienced deep pain, yet that very pain was a stepping stone to something far greater. Consider Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime, and imprisoned for years. If anyone had a right to wonder why they were going through such suffering, it was Joseph. But looking back at his life, we see that every step of his painful journey led him to a position where he could save not only his family, but an entire nation from famine. Joseph's pain wasn't a random series of unfortunate events. It was part of God's perfect plan for him. God was using the pain he endured to prepare him for the destiny he had in store. Similarly, when we look at the life of Job, we see a man who faced unimaginable loss and suffering. Job lost his wealth, his health, and his family. Yet in the end, God restored him even more than he had before. Job's pain was not without purpose. It was a testing of his faith and a way for God to show His faithfulness in the midst of the storm. Job didn't know at the time why he was suffering, but through his pain, he gained a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty and goodness. Pain, though uncomfortable and challenging, is not without purpose. It is often in the most painful moments that we experience the greatest growth. Think about the process of refining gold. When gold is mined, it's not in its purest form. It has to go through a refining process where it is heated to high temperatures, causing impurities to rise to the surface so they can be removed. Only after enduring the intense heat is the gold transformed into its purest state. Similarly, we are refined in the fire of our trials. It's through pain that God removes the impurities in our character, our selfishness, our pride, our fear, and purifies us, making us more like Him. The pain we experience serves as a tool for growth and transformation. It forces us to confront areas of our lives that we might otherwise ignore. It challenges our faith and stretches our trust in God. But it's important to remember that God never wastes our pain. He uses it for a purpose. He is with us in the struggle, walking with us through the fire, and using every moment of hardship to prepare us for something greater. In fact, pain often opens the door to breakthroughs we wouldn't otherwise experience. It's easy to praise God when everything is going well, when life is comfortable and easy, but it's in the seasons of pain and struggle that we learn to depend on God in ways we never could when everything was smooth sailing. It's in the pain that we are reminded that we are not self-sufficient. We need God. And it is in our weakness that His strength is made perfect. As we navigate through painful seasons, it's crucial to remember that God is not distant or indifferent to our suffering. He sees every tear, every heartbreak, and every wound. He is not some distant observer passively watching from afar. He is a loving Father who walks with us through our pain and uses it for His good purposes. Romans 8:28 tells us that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Even when it feels like life is falling apart, God is still working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for our good. The truth is, we will all experience pain in this life. No one is immune to suffering, but what makes all the difference is how we respond to that pain. We can choose to allow it to embitter us, to harden our hearts, and to drive us away from God, or we can choose to trust that God is using our pain for a purpose. We can choose to believe that every trial, every hardship, and every moment of suffering is part of God's greater plan for our lives. Pain has a way of teaching us things that comfort and ease never could. It forces us to rely on God in ways we might not have before. It humbles us and reminds us that we are not in control. It draws us closer to God as we learn to trust Him even when we don't understand. And it deepens our compassion for others who are going through similar struggle. When we experience pain, we gain a deeper understanding of the pain others are facing, and we are better equipped to comfort and encourage them in their journey. So the next time you find yourself in the midst of a painful season, remember this: God is not absent. He is not punishing you. He is using your pain to shape you, refine you, and position you for the purpose He has planned for you. He is with you in the struggle, and He will bring you through it, just as He did with Joseph, Job, and countless others. He will turn your pain into something beautiful. God is a master at taking what was meant for harm and using it for good. He takes our brokenness and creates something new, something stronger, something more beautiful than we could have imagined. And while we may not understand the pain in the moment, we can trust that God is using it to prepare us for the next season of our lives. God's plan is always bigger than our current pain. Every moment of suffering, every tear, every broken heart, God is working through it, and He will use it for a greater purpose. So don't give up in the middle of your pain. Keep trusting, keep pressing forward, because pain is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter in the story God is writing in your life.
This idea may be hard to grasp, especially when you're in the middle of it. But I want to remind you that God is always working behind the scenes, even when things don't look the way you want them to. Sometimes the detours, the disappointments, and the setbacks we experience are not signs that we're on the wrong path. They're signs that God is preparing us for something greater. Think about the story of David. David was anointed to be king of Israel when he was just a young shepherd boy. God had a plan for him, and that plan was to eventually take the throne. But the road to the throne was not a straight line. In fact, it was anything but easy. Instead of walking straight into a palace, David found himself on the run for his life, fleeing from King Saul, who saw him as a threat. David faced betrayal, rejection, and loneliness. He spent years in hiding, living in caves, far from the palace he had been promised. It would have been easy for David to think that the setback of living in fear and uncertainty was a sign that he was no longer part of God's plan. But in those years of wilderness, God was preparing David for the throne in ways he couldn't have imagined. David wasn't just learning how to be a king during that time. He was learning how to trust God when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. He was learning humility, patience, and how to be a leader in the midst of adversity. His setbacks weren't failures, they were setups. God was setting him up for something bigger than he could have understood at the time. And when the time was right, David was able to step into his role as king with a deep understanding of God's power and provision. When we experience setbacks, it's easy to feel as if we're being punished or that somehow we've failed. But setbacks are often part of the process. They don't mean that we're not where we're supposed to be. In fact, they can be signs that we're exactly where God wants us to be. It's in those moments that we are being tested, refined, and shaped for the next level of our journey. I think about the way a great athlete trains for a big competition. When they first start out, they might not be able to perform at their best. They face challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But every failure, every injury, every setback is part of their training process. They learn from their mistakes. They grow stronger through their struggles, and eventually they're able to perform at a level they never could have reached without those setbacks. The setbacks don't define them, they set them up for success. Similarly, when we face setbacks in our own lives, we need to understand that they're not the end of the road. They're often a part of God's greater preparation process. God is using the setbacks to build our character, to strengthen our faith, and to equip us for what's ahead. When we hit a wall or experience a failure, it's not necessarily a sign that we've been rejected. Sometimes it's a sign that God is working on something bigger, something better in our lives. Consider the story of Joseph. Joseph's journey was filled with setbacks, being sold into slavery by his brothers, being falsely accused of a crime, and spending years in prison. But each of those setbacks served as a stepping stone toward his ultimate destiny. What seemed like a failure, a loss, or a detour was actually a part of God's plan to elevate him to a position of influence and power. In the midst of those setbacks, God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail of Joseph's life. When he finally rose to power in Egypt, he was in a position to save his family and an entire nation. The setbacks were not a sign that God had abandoned Joseph. They were the very thing that set him up for his purpose. The key to understanding setbacks is shifting our perspective. Instead of seeing them as failures or signs of rejection, we need to see them as opportunities for growth and preparation. Every setback is an opportunity to become stronger, wiser, and more resilient. It's in the setbacks that we learn perseverance, patience, and trust in God. We often can't see it in the moment, but God is at work in the midst of our struggles. He's using the setbacks to prepare us for something greater than we can imagine. Sometimes the reason we face setbacks is because God is protecting us from something we can't see. There may be a door that looks like it's opening, but if we were to walk through it, it might lead us down a path that isn't in line with God's best for our lives. In those moments, God allows the setback to keep us from going in the wrong direction. We may not understand it at the time, but we can trust that God knows what's best for us. What seems like a disappointment could be God's way of protecting us and redirecting us towards something better. There's also a spiritual principle at work here. When we face setbacks, it's often an opportunity for us to humble ourselves and rely more fully on God. It's easy to become self-reliant when things are going well. But when we hit a setback, we are reminded of our dependence on God. It's in those moments of weakness that God's strength is most evident. We may feel like we've hit a wall, but that's often when God is preparing us to experience a breakthrough. The setbacks are the setup for the breakthrough. Another important aspect of setbacks is how they shape our character. Character is forged in the fire of adversity. When we face challenges, we have the opportunity to grow in patience, integrity, and resilience. If everything always went according to our plans, we wouldn't have the opportunity to develop the depth of character that God desires for us. Setbacks challenge us to rely on God's timing, to trust in His plan, and to develop the character traits necessary for the future He has prepared for us. At the same time, setbacks can serve as a reminder that we don't always know the bigger picture. We see only what's in front of us, but God sees the entire map. When we face setbacks, it's important to trust that God is leading us, even when we can't see where He's taking us. He's always working behind the scenes, weaving together a beautiful tapestry of our lives. The setbacks are just a small part of the larger picture. In the end, your setback is a setup for a greater breakthrough, a greater blessing, and a greater purpose. It may not seem like it now, but trust that God is using this moment to prepare you for what's ahead. Your setbacks are not the end. They're the beginning of something greater that God has planned for you. God doesn't waste your pain. This statement is a powerful reminder of something we often forget in the middle of our struggles, that every single trial, hardship, and moment of suffering is not wasted in God's hands. It's difficult to fully understand or accept in the midst of pain, but what if every heartbreak, every betrayal, every setback, and every difficult season was part of something greater that God was working in our lives? What if, instead of seeing pain as an interruption to our plans, we started seeing it as part of God's divine plan for our growth and purpose? Too often when we go through painful times, our first instinct is to ask, why me? We want to understand why we have to experience this kind of suffering or hardship. We question God's love for us, wondering how a loving God could allow us to go through something so painful. We may even feel abandoned or forsaken, as though God is distant and indifferent to our pain. But I want to remind you today that God sees your pain. He knows your heartache, your tears, and the burdens you carry, and He is with you in the middle of it all. The truth is that God doesn't waste pain because He is always working in it, through it, and beyond it. Every single moment of hardship you experience is an opportunity for God to shape you, refine you, and mold you into the person He created you to be. Pain is never pointless when you trust that God is working in the midst of it. It might feel like it's pointless in the moment, but God has a way of using our pain to create something beautiful, something stronger, something more profound. Think about the story of Jesus Christ. His pain, the suffering He endured on the cross, was not wasted. It was the ultimate expression of God's love for humanity. Through his suffering, Jesus made a way for us to be reconciled to God. His pain was not in vain. It was the means by which salvation and eternal life were made available to all who believe. What seemed like the most tragic moment in history, the crucifixion, was actually the most significant, powerful, and redemptive act in all of human history. God took what was meant for evil and used it for good. In the same way, God doesn't waste your pain. Every hurt you experience, every trial you face, every tear you shed is being used to mold you into a person who is more like Jesus. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This means that even in the moments that seem the most painful and unjust, God is still at work. He's still turning your pain into something beautiful. He's still using your struggles to grow your faith, to teach you perseverance, and to shape your character. Pain often has a way of making us feel weak, vulnerable, and helpless, but it is in those very moments of weakness that God's strength is made perfect. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Our pain forces us to rely on God, to trust in his strength, and to recognize that we cannot do it on our own. It humbles us and teaches us to surrender our control to him. In our moments of pain, God is calling us to depend more fully on him and to trust that his grace is enough. When you look at the lives of people in the Bible who endured great suffering, you can see how God used their pain for his purposes. Take the story of Job, for example. Job was a man who had everything, a large family, wealth, health, and a good reputation. But in a single moment, his world was turned upside down. He lost everything, his children, his wealth, and even his health. Job's pain was excruciating, and yet, through it all, God was working. He was testing Job's faith and character. Job could have chosen to turn away from God in his pain, but instead, he chose to trust that God was still good, even in the midst of his suffering. And in the end, God restored Job, giving him back even more than he had before. Job's pain was not wasted. It was part of God's plan to deepen his relationship with God and to refine his faith.